At 2:20 a.m. local time, while traversing the Mediterranean Sea, an unexpected fire erupted in the cockpit of the aircraft. The fire alarm sounded urgently, prompting the crew to make frantic attempts to extinguish the flames. Dense black smoke quickly filled the cabin, inciting panic among the passengers. The autopilot system failed, and the aircraft experienced a violent shake, tilting sharply to the left by 90 degrees. Shortly thereafter, the plane executed a complete 360-degree spin to the right before plunging directly into the frigid waters of the Mediterranean Sea. The black box and cockpit voice recorder were subsequently recovered from the ocean floor, uncovering a chilling truth about the events occurring in the cockpit. Was this incident part of a premeditated terrorist plot? The forthcoming video will provide further insights. On May 18, 2016, at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, France, an Airbus A320 aircraft belonging to EgyptAir was in the process of being refueled in preparation for a flight exceeding 4 hours. Flight MS-804 was set to depart from Charles de Gaulle Airport to Cairo, Egypt, covering a distance of 3,200 kilometers. The aircraft, an Airbus, a A320-232 with the registration number SUGCC, was 13 years old and powered by two IAV 2,527 of 5 engines. Notably, the aircraft had undergone significant maintenance and overhaul just 4 days prior. It is important to highlight this detail as it is pivotal to the narrative. A total of 66 individuals were on board, comprising 56 passengers and 10 crew members, with nearly half being Egyptian citizens. Among the passengers were 3 children and 2 infants. The flight was commanded by Captain Mohammed Shoker, who possessed 6,275 hours of flying experience, including 2,101 hours on the A320 aircraft. He was a distinguished pilot at EgyptAir, holding an impressive academic background from the United States. Captain Shoker had been with EgyptAir for 5 years. Accompanying him was First Officer Mohammed Asim, who had accumulated 2,766 hours of flying experience, with 1,128 hours specifically on the A320. Asim was relatively new to the profession, having only flown the A320 as his sole commercial aircraft. Prior to boarding, Captain Shoker took the opportunity to purchase coffee to help him remain alert during the flight, also remembering to buy an additional cup for his colleague. He expressed his appreciation for the Americano from the shop, stating it was quite delicious. After confirming that all flight procedures were completed, he instructed the crew to board the aircraft. Co-pilot Mohammed Asim promptly organized the flight documents and 3 bottles of hairspray he had purchased for a friend into a paper bag. The 2 pilots then swiftly boarded the A320. At approximately 11:00 p.m., the aircraft commenced its takeoff. The plane, producing a deep rumbling sound from its engines, headed southeast, with an estimated arrival in Cairo around 3:00 a.m. The air traffic control communicated MS-804 ready for takeoff at runway 27, to which the response was MS-804 cleared for takeoff runway 27, wind 270, speed 10 knots. As the flight progressed, Captain Mohammed Shoker, leading the operation, was able to ascend smoothly to cruising altitude due to the favorable weather conditions, achieving this by 11:10 p.m. The aircraft ascended to an altitude of 10,000 feet, during which Captain Mohammed Shiri maintained communication with air traffic control for further guidance. At 11:30 p.m., approximately 30 minutes after takeoff, the A320 had successfully climbed to a stable altitude of 37,000 feet. This marked a period when the crew could relax and recuperate, as up to this point, all operations had proceeded smoothly. Most passengers were asleep, preparing for a flight that would extend over 4 hours. However, an overlooked cigarette would soon mark the beginning of a tragic aviation incident. At 2 a.m. on May 19, 2016, while the cabin remained quiet, the cockpit was filled with conversation. The two pilots, having collaborated on numerous occasions, engaged in lively discussion. Despite the tranquil night sky, Captain Muhammad Shari struggled to stay alert, as the effects of caffeine were insufficient to keep him awake. As yawns became more frequent and his eyelids grew heavy, the captain opted to step out for a cigarette to maintain his alertness. Before exiting the cockpit, he informed his colleague, First Officer Mohammed Asim, "I am going to the restroom for a cigarette. Please monitor the aircraft for me. I will return shortly." It is noteworthy that, at that time, EgyptAir permitted both passengers and crew to smoke on board. At 2:10 a.m., mere moments after the captain's departure, the control computer triggered a smoke warning in the restroom. However, the first officer, aware that the captain was smoking, promptly disregarded the alert. The desire to smoke soon affected First Officer Mohammed Asim as well, prompting him to take a similar action. Upon boarding the aircraft, the first officer retrieved a cigarette from his pocket, lit it, and began smoking in the cockpit. He had placed a paper bag, which contained flight documents and 3 bottles of hairspray intended for a friend, along with his phone and iPad on the control panel, an area equipped with numerous vents for the aircraft's cooling system. This seemingly ordinary paper bag, which I previously mentioned, would later prove to be significant in altering the course of an entire flight, specifically Flight 804. As the narrative unfolds, the importance of this detail will become clearer. After smoking nearly half of the cigarette, the first officer, ASM, satisfied his craving, set the remaining portion on the control panel beside the paper bag. At 2:17 a.m., the cockpit's computer began issuing a smoke warning, which the first officer chose to ignore. Shortly thereafter, the captain returned to the cockpit and took his seat. Mohammed Shoker then pulled out some photographs he had taken earlier to share with the first officer. The two became deeply engaged in conversation, disregarding the computer's warnings. Unlike certain Boeing 737 models, the Airbus A320 operates through a sophisticated electronic computer system, with all aircraft operations routed through this complex computer. All flight control devices are located in a compartment beneath the cockpit floor, which is a critical area for the operation of the aircraft. In the A320 model, pilots do not have direct control over the plane. Instead, when a pilot issues a command via the control stick, signals are transmitted to the flight control computer. This computer processes the signals and subsequently instructs the aircraft's control surfaces, such as the ailerons, elevators, and rudder, to adjust their positions. These adjustments enable the aircraft to change its direction and altitude in accordance with the pilot's commands. Consequently, any malfunction in the computer can render the entire aircraft inoperable. During a conversation with Captain Mohammed Shoker, the first officer inadvertently neglected the cigarette he was smoking. Mohammed Asim was unaware that this moment of distraction would lead to a catastrophic event for Egypt's aviation sector. At 2:23 a.m., for reasons yet to be determined, the co-pilot's cigarette ignited, unnoticed by either pilot. The fire rapidly spread to a nearby paper bag, which contained flammable materials such as butane and propane from hairspray, exacerbating the situation. This was merely the onset of the disaster. As the fire began, small embers and flames started to fall into the aircraft's ventilation system. At this juncture, the captain detected an unusual smell and quickly verified that it was not emanating from a cigarette. Upon looking up, both pilots were confronted with a dire situation. The captain and co-pilot were taken aback to discover flames above the control panel, prompting them to immediately vacate their seats in an urgent attempt to extinguish the fire. Muhammad and Sam swiftly retrieved a fire extinguisher as the clock struck 2 225A. Meanwhile, the computer continued to emit smoke warnings from the control room, accompanied by numerous other alerts. Despite the pilots' valiant efforts to quell the flames, their attempts proved futile as the fire appeared to be intensifying, seemingly fueled by an unknown source. Thick black smoke rapidly permeated the cabin, rousing the passengers from their slumber. Panic and fear were palpable on their faces, with many sensing an impending disaster. The flight attendants rushed to reassure the passengers, though they themselves were gripped by fear, acutely aware that something dire was approaching. Tragically, at 2:27 a.m., the pilots of the A320 faced their worst nightmare. A fire had erupted in the control center. The flames in this critical area were significantly larger than those in the cockpit. As previously noted, the control room is vital to the aircraft's operation. Any malfunction poses a severe threat to safety. In a sudden turn of events, the autopilot disengaged, resulting in a precarious situation that would lead to extreme challenges in maintaining control of the aircraft. At 2:28 a.m., as anticipated, the situation became extremely precarious due to the loss of autopilot control, causing the aircraft to tilt sharply to the left. The A320 began to descend over the Mediterranean Sea, resulting in both crew and passengers being thrown to the left side of the cabin. The two pilots rushed back to their seats in an attempt to stabilize the altitude, but the aircraft was nearly uncontrollable. A fire had engulfed the cockpit, and both the captain and co-pilot were gradually succumbing to smoke inhalation. The chaos escalated, and by 2:30 a.m., the plane executed a full 360 spin to the right before ultimately plunging into the frigid waters of the Mediterranean Sea. This sequence of events unfolded in a matter of mere minutes, revealing the tragic circumstances surrounding the disaster and the unsettling truth behind the Egyptian government's cover-up. EgyptAir flight MS-804 concluded its journey in the Mediterranean. With no miraculous survival, all 66 individuals on board lost their lives. Although the black box emitted a distress signal, search efforts yielded a number of bodies insufficient to account for all passengers. It is uncommon for a passenger aircraft to crash in contemporary times, leading many to suspect a premeditated terrorist attack. 3 months prior, another EgyptAir A320 was hijacked during a domestic flight. Furthermore, on October 31, 2015, a Russian passenger plane was bombed shortly after departing from the resort town of Sharm el-Sheikh, resulting in the deaths of 224 individuals. These incidents have fueled speculation and concern regarding the safety of EgyptAir and air travel within Egypt, particularly given the airline's history of inconsistent safety record. In recent years, there has been a noticeable improvement, however, as the national airline, the Egyptian government consistently suppressed and obstructed Airbus from disclosing investigation data. The government maintained that the aircraft was bombed and insisted it was unrelated to EgyptAir. This raises the question of what the actual cause was. To explore this, let us revisit the events that transpired 4 days prior to the EgyptAir 804 disaster. The Airbus A320 was undergoing maintenance after an extended period of operation, with routine checks performed by the engineering team of EgyptAir. A significant detail to note is that the co-pilot's oxygen mask had been replaced, and immediately following this replacement, the mask was tested within the system, which was set to emergency mode. In this mode, the oxygen mask delivers oxygen at a higher pressure, providing more oxygen than in standard mode. However, due to a mistake, the mask was improperly configured to emergency mode, resulting in an oxygen leak. French investigators theorized that this leaking oxygen saturated the cockpit air, thereby increasing the risk of a sudden fire. This also accounts for the rapid and uncontrollable spread of the fire once it ignited. Nevertheless, Experts have asserted that the oxygen leak alone would not have been sufficient to initiate the fire that ultimately destroyed the aircraft. It was merely one contributing factor to the tragedy of EgyptAir Flight 804. A chilling aspect of the ill-fated flight was that the crew and passengers were unaware that, after resuming operations post-maintenance, the aircraft had experienced 3 emergency landings due to computer malfunctions. Notifications regarding significant system malfunctions began on the late evening of May 17th, when the aircraft departed for Asmara, Eritrea, returning to Cairo in the early hours of May 18th. This was followed by a round trip to Tunis and a subsequent flight to Paris on the night of May 18th, culminating in the crash early on May 19th. During these 3 flights, emergency landings were necessitated shortly after takeoff. It is important to note that upon receiving the aircraft, engineers discovered that the computer had registered over 7 errors in the control circuit system, along with various electrical issues. Rather than grounding the aircraft, the engineering team opted to deactivate the circuit breaker and restart it, a decision intended to reset the error messages and mislead the pilots into continuing their flights. This negligence ultimately resulted in the tragic loss of 66 innocent lives. The factors contributing to the disaster of Flight MS-804 can be summarized as follows. The A320 aircraft was deemed unfit for operation due to unresolved pre-existing technical issues. The pilot's negligence in smoking ignited the aircraft's computer system, disabling critical controls. The fire escalated uncontrollably as a result of maintenance failures by EgyptAir, and the improper installation of the co-pilot's oxygen mask caused an oxygen leak, which, when combined with the fire, made extinguishing it nearly impossible. These conclusions were drawn by Airbus following their investigation into the aviation accident.